lifting up Jesus, opening His Word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV.
Hi, this is Tim Worth with Moriel TV and Moriel Radio, and I'm here live in England with Jacob Prasch via Skype. And Jacob, the first question is, what is synthetic parallelism in Hebrew poetry?
Synthetic parallelism is a theological term invented by Western critical scholars who look at the scriptures, particularly the Old Testament, from a literary perspective as opposed to a purely theological or doctrinal perspective. We have to understand something, that the ancient Israelites would not have had the same concepts of looking at the scriptures. Well, they would have looked at the scriptures, the same scriptures, but they would not have delineated them along the lines of this linear reasoning that's made for the Western mind. They didn't think of it exactly in those terms. Let's understand what this kind of synthetic parallelism is. Synthetic parallelism is where a second or third line of a psalm, usually a psalm, or of a unit or passage of scripture, are antithetical to the first line, but they use this dissonance of being antithetical to push the meaning of the first two lines. An example would be, as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. That's a classic example most people use. The lines of the synthetic parallelism relate by the logical conclusion that you draw from it, sort of. Fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him lack nothing. Synthetic parallelism tries to push out a concise thought or a concise theological statement by using parallelism. Now, there are other types of parallelisms theologians cite. Synthetic is only one of them. There's something known as climactic parallelism. That's what they call it. Very often in Hebrew poetry, but even in other passages of the Old Testament, including apocalyptic, when you see repetition, the same thing said twice, those are usually used in eschatological passages or passages about the last days. When you see the same words stated twice in a poetic forum or format, well, that's what scholars call climactic parallelism. But they usually designate, when you understand them in their context and what they're actually saying, they usually point ahead to the last days, to the return of Christ. They're second coming passages in the Old Testament when you have climactic parallelism. But there are more simpler forms. There's something known as symmetrical parallelism. In symmetrical parallelism, there's basically two types. Where you have two lines of a verse, it's called a distic. And when you have three lines, it's a tristic. Again, a classic example is, who may ascend to the mountain of the Lord? Or who may stand in his holy place? That is a distic. He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to an idol, or swear by what is false, in the 24th Psalm. So you have these distichs and tristichs, but you understand the scholars who use these classifications are trying to fit ancient Hebrew poetry into Western linear outlines, because that's the way people in the West think. There's also, in addition, the antithetic parallelism, where you have coupled triplets. The Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. I personally think that of all of these, the one that's most doctrinally important for Christians is what they would call the climactic, where you see something in a psalm reiterated, the same words reiterated twice. That is usually an indication that it has a future prophetic meaning for the last days. It may have some application generally, or it may have some application to the circumstances, that is the Sitzum Leben and the life and culture the psalmist was writing in, but they somehow hint or point ahead to something prophetic concerning the last days. If you're interested in academic theology, you can study these things all day long. But remember, it's mainly Western scholars trying to classify this literature in a Western way. The early Christians did not have those same types of classifications. The early Christians essentially classified literature along the same lines that the ancient Hebrews did. The first Christians being Jewish, they went by literary genre. They classified things by literary genre, and they understood the connections by virtue of cognate relationships between passages, verses, and texts. Something called binyan ab mishtei ketubim. This is midrashic. St. Paul did this continually, having been educated by Rabbi Gamaliel in the school of Hillel. Binyan ab mishtei ketubim is where you build the doctrinal or theological argument from two texts, two different texts, even though they may somehow seem to be talking about different things. When you really understand the context of each, and they're using the same phraseology and terms, the same considerations apply to each. Now we have teachings where we illustrate this or demonstrate this, binyan ad mishtei ketubim. Having been to seminary and Bible college, etc., graduate school, whatever, and I don't even like to talk about that kind of thing unless there's a reason for me to do so, but I have a formal theological education. I, however, do not put the emphasis on those things, even though I know what scholars, academic theologians say. My emphasis has always been to go back to how did the first century church understand these things. So you can talk about these things, and I sometimes use theological terms myself. You know, you hear me using terms like soteriology or eschatology or things of this nature, or you might hear me use the term neo-Montanism, which is the actual theological term for charismatic or Pentecostal extremism. I'll use these terms when they're convenient, but they're not an emphasis on my approach to study of Scripture. My emphasis on approach to study of Scripture is to handle the Scriptures the way Jesus and the apostles did, and the authors of the Gospels did. That is my focus. Nonetheless, I am aware of the academic literary criticism and the way that Western scholars have tried to organize hermeneutics and biblical interpretation and exegesis into a linear format that suits the Western mindset. The origin of this dichotomy comes from the Hebrew way of thinking opposed to the Greek way of thinking. Our way of thinking about the Scripture in the Western world is essentially Hellenistic in origin. It came from the Church Fathers, and then it was basically reframed during the Reformation on the basis of grammatical historical exegesis. This dichotomy between the Hebrew and Greek way of thinking reflect worldviews. The Church Fathers Hellenized the Church, but they also Hellenized theology under the influences of Greek philosophy. That is the source of this Western approach to Scripture, where they think in this organized sense of linear rationalism. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm simply saying that is not primarily how Jesus and the apostles handled Scripture. While again, from my own theological education, I'm quite aware of the way the Church Fathers handled Scripture, the way that grammatical historical exegesis evolved out of the Reformation from 16th century humanism. Well, I'm quite aware of literary criticism, source criticism, form criticism, etc. I'm aware of these things. I'm aware of the way that Western academic theologians attempt to classify or categorize different genres of literature. My plea has again always been, we have to first of all revert to the way that Jesus and the apostles understood and handled Scripture. We have to go back to the first century church, to the first century Judeo-Christian church that got its theology from Jewish believers in Jesus and from Jesus himself and his disciples. We have to go back and make that our point of commencement, not Western models of literary criticism. Not that they're wrong, not that they cannot be helpful, but they are not what should be ontogenetically fundamental. We have to go back to the source.
Thank you, Jacob.